Hey guys, now let's discuss the third process of scope management knowledge area, which is define scope. So first we started with the planning of scope management where we were discussing about how we will define the scope. Then we moved into the collect requirements phase where we work with the stakeholders to gather the requirements from the stakeholders. And now this is the third piece, which is our defining of scope. So whatever requirements which we defined in the scope management, in the collect requirements process, now it is the time to give a detailed description of that. Your output would be the project scope statement, which will contain that detailed information. So let's see, it's a planning process to create a detailed understanding of the project scope. The process group which we are doing, this is part of the planning process group. So while collect requirements has already been performed, this process refines the team understanding of the project work. So your team might have some confusion about those requirements and they want to review and they want to see some more details about it. This is the document, project scope statement, which will help them in this particular scenario. This understanding is documented in the project scope statement, which is the one of the outputs of this process. Let's see the top 3 points. The consumption, it's about improving your understanding of project scope and documenting that understanding. So first, as a team member, you want to implement a particular requirement and you want to know, what all things are part of it. This is where you would go back, see that document, the scope statement, and talk more about it and understand more about it. Importance, the project scope statement contains the detailed description of scope. Very important. This document would be used by a lot of other processes because they want to really know what all things this document entails and what all things this document will help them to take an informed decision. Management, this may be revisited often throughout the project. So again, as more and more requirements would be identified, you need to update this document. Why? Because you would have to explain those requirements in much more detail. You don't explain those requirements in details in the requirements document, but you do that in the scope statement, which is an output of this process. Okay, so now let's see the ITTOs of this. So on the input side, we have the project charter, then we have the project management plan, we have some of the project documents, and then we have the EEF OPA. On the tools, we have expert judgment, decision making, interpersonal and team skills, product analysis, and the data analysis. Output, we will have two main, which is the project scope statement and the document updates. So now let's review each of these inputs, tools, and techniques, and of course the outputs in much more detail. So first of all, always whenever I'm explaining you these ITTOs, you need to remember one thing. You need to ask these questions to yourself, that why this document or why this particular plan is an input to this process, why it is, or why it is the tool, why it is the output. You have to ask those questions to yourself. So first we have the project management plan. So project management plan and specifically the scope management plan, which will talk about that how you will define the scope. So unless you cannot just go ahead and define the scope unless you know that how you will do that. And scope management plan would help you to understand that. Then project charter would also be another input, an important input, because if you remember, project charter has the high level scope defined in the project charter, and this is where you would explain that high level scope defined in the project charter in much more detail. If you don't have your ITTO sheet, I really appreciate, stop this video right now, go to the website www.eduhubspot.com and download the free ITTO sheet. When you download it, go to the third tab, the differentiation tab, to see the difference between the project charter and the scope statement. What all different things are part of both of these documents. Very important. And if you already have that, then see the difference between those two documents. Then for the project documents, we have the assumption log, requirements documentation, and the risk register. So assumption log, the things which we assume to be true, like the same example of my friend, who is helping me to buy this car. So I'm assuming that he will be there to explain me what all different features he was talking about. He would have to describe that in more detail. I just have the high level feature that I need a car which is safe and secure. That's it. But he would be the one who would tell me the difference between what all different safety measures are, and he might even actually rank them. So that's an assumption log, that I'm assuming that he would be the one who would be helping. He would be the one who would be giving his expert judgment to me. Then requirements documentation. What are you describing? What are you describing in detail? You are actually describing the requirements defined in the requirement documentation in much more detail. So of course we need the requirement documentation. And risk register. What if the car I'm planning to buy, planning to customize is not worth it, right? It's too expensive and it's not what I was really looking for. That's risk register. Then we have the common inputs, the EEF and OPA. Remember the EEF, the enterprise environmental factors, something which is not in control with the project team, like your organizational culture. That's the biggest example. OPA, same thing, your processes, your procedures, your policies, your lessons learned, um, all those are actually part of your OPA. So these are the common ones you can, think, you can keep it. Next, we have the tools and techniques. So in tools and techniques, of course, we have my friend who is helping me to buy that car. That's expert judgment. As far as decision making is concerned, I have multi-criteria decision analysis, something which is, I would say the criterias I have defined to buy that car. Like for me, luxury was important. For my family, probably safety was security was more important. Then for others, like let's say for my family, let's say speed is more important, right? So again, these were the different multiple criterias I used in order to buy the car. Okay. Then interpersonal and team skills, facilitation, one of the tool which we already discussed in the previous process, collect requirements process. We also briefly discussed this in the integration management knowledge area. If you remember, facilitation technique, more like a facilitated workshop where we have a facilitator trying to work with the stakeholders to define the scope in more detail. The three examples were the JAD session, joint application development. Then we have the QFD, quality functional deployment, and then the voice over customer, if you remember that example. And then the third was the use cases, so user stories. So all those were part of the facilitative workshop where multiple stakeholders come under the one roof and try to describe the scope. Then we have the product analysis. In this technique, the team asks questions about the products and services. It helps to define the deliverable scope in much more detail. Example includes the product breakdown, requirement analysis, system analysis, value analysis, and the system/value engineering. So again, product analysis is important. I do that all the time for my simulator. I talk to the students and I tell them that what are the things which are good, what are the services which are good, which you don't find it, what are the things which can help you to study more or study better. All those things are I discuss with the students on our social networking groups, the Facebook and LinkedIn's. So I heavily do that. I analyze the product, and this helps me to define the scope of my product. Then on the data analysis side, we have the alternative analysis. Anything we do, we have alternative options. Like if you remember the example I gave you from that Varun needs to travel from DC, Washington DC to New York. So what are the different alternatives to do that, right? I can take a car, I can take a bus, I can drive myself, I can fly, I can walk. All these alternatives have some pros and cons. Like flying would be the most expensive one, but it's the fastest option for me. If I want to do that, I'll probably do that. I want to have comfort, pit stop anywhere I want, I'll probably take my own car. But if my goal is to take the cheapest option, I probably take the bus. And if let's say I'm looking for more I'm preparing for a marathon, or I'm preparing for something crazy, I will probably walk as well. No, I'm not saying I'll do that, but I'm just giving you different alternative options for that. So everything has their own pros and cons, and you would probably select that based upon your own choice. Okay, now let's quickly talk about the outputs. So we have two outputs over here. First, we have the project scope statement, and something which will describe in much more details the requirements. Then, as far as the document updates is concerned, assumption log, which was there in the input as well, right? Requirements documentation, the traceability matrix, the stakeholder register. So, like for example, when you're describing a particular requirement, think from this perspective that you came to know that you might need a stakeholder A from team B, which you have never involved. Like you have never involved that stakeholder in your project. So what will you do? You reach out to that person, and now that person will also become a stakeholder on your project. And if that person becomes a stakeholder on a project, you probably would have to go and update your stakeholder register also. So that's why you see stakeholder register as an output to this process. Okay, since the beginning, we have been talking about one word. I would say the most important word was the project scope statement. But what is this scope statement? It's the documented project requirement that sets focus the expectations of the project stakeholders, but in much more detail. So the keyword is the detailed description of the project scope of the requirements as well. So first of all, it's progressively elaborated. If you remember the progressive elaboration concept we did in the introduction section, where not all the requirements are known upfront, but you constantly update them as you know more and more information about them. It will include both the project as well as product scope. Remember the diagram of product and project scope, where the product scope was in the middle, the features of that product, and project scope was the outermost umbrella. Like how much time you will take to implement this feature, how much cost it will take to implement those. So all those things were the project scope. But when you're dealing with the specifications of that product, that's product scope. It will also includes the assumptions and constraints. So assumptions and constraint, this is an important topic, right? You will have assumptions and constraints as well. It will also tell about the in scope and as well as the out of scope items. So what are the project exclusions? You will talk about the acceptance criteria, how you will accept that how the customer will accept that scope. So acceptance criteria would also be laid out in this. Then project deliverables, the deliverables are mentioned over here, and of course the detailed description of the project. All of these are actually the content of the project scope statement. So one of the questions which I have you may encounter in the real exam could be that which of the following is part of project scope statement, or which of the following is not a part of project scope statement. So you need to memorize when you go and read the PMBOK, make sure that these fours are definitely in, and sometimes it might have some more information as well. Okay, let's do a quick revision, and then we will go over the next process in the next video. So on the study focus side, we will see focus our efforts on understanding the primary output, which is the scope statement. So scope statement will be your a primary output, an important one, which will have a detailed description of the scope. Remember, detailed description. I'm putting a lot of stress on the detailed description because that's one of the most important keyword for this process. Know that the project scope statement is a narrative and detailed description of the requirements needed to successfully complete the project. So your team might come to you and ask you about what does this requirement mean. You probably can tell them to refer to the scope statement, because scope statement is the one which will have detailed description of that requirement what the team member is asking. Be aware that this process share a common thread of analyzing the scope in more detail. Yes, you analyze the scope in more detail, then only you can have a detailed description of that scope. The key benefit of this process is that it describes the product, service or result boundaries, and the acceptance criteria, the exclusions, the deliverables, the description. The by boundaries, I'm referring to your exclusion criteria over here. So this marks the completion of the scope statement, the defined scope. Next video we will be talking about the create WBS process. Thank you.